New research suggests the cost of the UK leaving the European Union could cost individual British households a lot. The UK is holding a referendum in June on whether the country should stay in the EU or leave. Our correspondent Owen Fairclough has been looking at the numbers and is here to explain. Owen, what did you find out?
RCA, that old saying about lies, damn lies, and statistics was probably never more appropriate than for the barrage of figures we've been getting over the cost of potentially of the EU, of Britain leaving the EU. These ones are worth taking a look at, though. The OECD, that's the think tank for the world's richest countries, think that the cost in economic output or lost economic output per household in the UK would be just over $3,000 a year. That might be the cost of a holiday in the sun, depending on where you go. Interestingly, the UK government did its own sums on this a few weeks ago. They're even more pessimistic and think that lost output would be around $6,000 per year. Now, I also crunched a few more numbers on this at the risk of drowning you in statistics based on the cost of EU membership. Now, that equates to around $60 billion a year. That's based on what the UK pays into the budget to belong to the EU, on what the out-camp, those who want out of Europe, estimate the cost of regulation. Now, that would equate to around $3,000 per year per household, the cost of being in Europe. Now, the camp that wants to remain in Europe, well, they think the benefits outweigh the cost. They say the benefits are around $4,000 per year. So a cost benefit, if you like, or certainly those benefits outweigh the cost. Now, these are just estimates. No one can really agree on these numbers, but the OECDs are at least from an organization without a political agenda, so not quite invested in the debate in the way that the government is. Well, the UK government thinks a dip in output recently is all down to investors and manufacturers sitting on the fence a little bit until they know the outcome of this referendum. Of course, the government would say that it wants to remain in Europe. So I asked Southampton University economist Mike Bastin if the British government was playing politics with the numbers.
They really do, I think, fear this vote. It could be very, very close, who knows, and they really are clasping at any opportunity to promote fears of economic downturn, damaging effects to the economy in terms of international trade and investment, and that's what they've jumped on immediately.
I'm glad you said a moment ago, who knows, because let's be honest, nobody really knows. We're seeing all these figures coming out in the pro, the anti-camp. They're all doing their sums and coming out with these figures. But the truth is, nobody really knows what the UK economy will look like should it leave the EU.
No. Well, they don't, but it has to be said that it's still well over half of our trade is with the European Union and European Union countries. So it's hard to accept the argument that there will be no damage in the short term and possibly the long term. But precisely how great that damage will be and how great it will have or hit the purses of the average British public is yet to be seen. Obviously, the Leave campaign are highlighting the fact that it will give the UK and UK businesses more opportunity to do trade independently, particularly with fast emerging nations such as China.
The camp that wants to leave the European Union say the UK will be free to conduct its own trade deals, and yet the noises that we get from China is that really it wants to see the UK within a big trading bloc within the EU. So how do you square all that?
Well, again, there are two very, very interesting arguments there. On the China side, it certainly is the case that the investment we see in the UK recently, which is quite substantial, Chinese companies buying a lot of famous British brands like Hamleys, the toy shop, Weetabix a few years ago. We see Dalian Wonder investing heavily in London in construction. Really is part of a longer-term investment plan to penetrate markets across the European Union. They've made that very, very clear from the start. So once again, it is difficult not to sympathise with the Remain campaign and that it will have a deleterious effect on the investment attractiveness of the UK if it then resides outside the single European market.
But surely the anti-camp, the out-camp must have a point. It's an old law of business. If you've got something to sell, you're always going to find someone to trade with, and you can understand why they would say the UK will be free and doesn't need to fear conducting its own trade deals if you've got something to sell.
Well, yes. I mean, again, who knows what will actually happen? Certainly, there will be more freedom to conduct trade deals on their own terms, on their own pricing policies, and more freedom generally does perhaps give an impetus to British business and allow for more creativity, creative momentum. And the fastest growing markets around the world are outside the European Union. Growth remains sluggish, not just the BRIC nations, but other emerging nations in Asia and South America really will be the markets of the future. So, yeah, again, who knows in the long term, it could provide an opportunity for UK business. But without that belonging to the European Union, which is 500 million people, it's the single biggest market in the world, you do fear for British business going it alone.
And how much weight do you think it carries then when President Barack Obama, who was in the UK last week, said the UK will be at the back of the queue for any kind of trade deal with the US should it leave the EU? Do you think British voters buy that?
I think they probably do, and I think it carries huge weight. Obviously, the most powerful economy in the world, still by far the richest country in the world in per capita terms, still by far. When the leader of that country actually declares that there could be a huge negative impact, 10 years, it certainly has to be reckoned with, and to sort of go it alone, and for the Americans to say that, that again is very, very powerful. And obviously the Remain campaign are very, very pleased to hear that, and we just hear whimpering noises really from the Leave campaign, which didn't really counter that threat. So I think that was a very, very serious intervention, yes.
I sense, Mike, that you think, consistent with the polling we're seeing now, that the UK might well vote to remain in the EU.
I think it probably will be the case. I think it'll be quite close. I think a lot of British people will remain reluctantly. I think if they'll vote with their hearts, they'll leave. I think when they go into that polling booth and put that cross in on the ballot box, they'll vote with their heads, with their hands on their wallets, thinking about jobs, security, trade and investment, and they will very reluctantly put a cross in the Remain campaign, but the Remain camp. But I think it will be very, very close.